So, um, what I wanted to do here was just a kind of a recap, a reiteration that of the networking interactivity between the devices. Uh, the monitor that I'm looking at to my right, which is a tablet, which is on AirDroid Mirror or Air Mirror, uh, allows me to have the remote control of the tablet, which the tablet is sharing Chrome Remote Desktop to the main computer, which is recording OBS. So instead of me turning around all the time, as you've seen, and hitting the button for record, I can use the phone to mirror the tablet and hit the button for record. But none of this is going to happen without a network connectivity. So if you are in a remote situation, which is what a lot of this is about, how do you do this in a remote situation? And the answer is if you don't have access wherever you are to a network that all your devices and wireless and mics and WoW mic and everything else and phone and everything can be on, then you will have to engage the mobile hotspot and use that as your network. And how feasible that is, well, we don't know yet. Haven't really done it, don't know the cost, what's the data, right? Allotment. And as you might remember from a previous episode, another of these accessories, these add-on things, is the ability to take the cameras and the laptop, which everything at the remote situation would be plugged into, as well as the tablet, but specifically the laptop, and HDMI wireless to a projector. And that projector would then project whatever it is you're doing on the wall. And if not projecting it there, the wireless HDMI could serve other purposes. But the whole point is also to record an event, to document what the situation is. Let's take it, for example, what we are doing, which is wargaming with the miniatures, perhaps on a large table scale, 8 feet by 5 feet. And that's important because what does that mean? It means your camera has to be pretty high up to visually see the entire table. On a small 4x3 like this table, it's not really that big of an issue because you can see right now the camera is just, 5 feet up and it's a 4x3 table, not a problem. But on a larger table, you've got to get pretty high up to get that table in view. And so all of this is what that's what this is all about, to be able to effectively project, record, and then do audio and at some point maybe even live broadcasting. But the point is as well uh, to be able to create a final product which becomes the official record of whatever the event is, be it a convention, the Kenosha Museum thing that we got coming up in mid-February of 25, all that. So that's what this is all about, and that's why the experimentation is happening. All these devices and stuff we're trying to get everything to work. So in summary, what we're talking about here is a remote situation with a laptop being the main computer, which is in this studio, it's behind me. But on the remote situation, the laptop would be the server, the primary hub that's running OBS that all the cameras and mics and stuff are fed into. And if a net like again, if the network is not available, say it's locked down, nobody can have access, okay, fine. Then you have to use a mobile hotspot. And if that doesn't work, then you're left with direct connection to the laptop. And that's why it's important to understand what these parameters are. Okay, now all that being said, we're moving on with our 4x3 demonstration of the new printed map. And we've got our ancients figures on the table. And like I've said before, it's amazing having been so much year and a half or 2 years in 10 millimeter. And now with this group over here, you can see this is 12 millimeter, including the townhomes of the World War II collection being started. And then having the one going back to the 172, the figures are just ginormous, by twice as big. They're twice as tall, and handling them is kind of a joy and kind of unbelievable. Why did we ever, instead of, because at the time the technology didn't exist for 12 or 10 millimeter. Now it does. So all bets are off. But 172, as you can see, as you can imagine, or any of the large scales, 25, 28, whatever, they all have their place. And specifically speaking for World War II, in the 172 universe, the battle, even in a 4x3, it's very short. It's small. It's tiny. It's finite. It's platoon company at the most size. Every stand is a squad. But now, with the smaller scales, every stand is virtually a platoon, if not greater. And that's where the difference comes in. Now, you're still going to have a single vehicle being one vehicle, but the infantry can now be an entire platoon, because practicality, you're not going to have little tiny stands of squads everywhere. There's no need for it. A regiment is a regiment of infantry, 300 to 400 men, something like that, right? You don't have little companies. Well, you do in the Johnny Reb thing, but that's ridiculous. We've been saying it for years. Why are you troubling yourself with that kind of a finite thing with such a small bit of men, small models? In the Johnny Reb universe, for instance, yes, and apologies to John Hill and everybody else who has worked on that kind of thing. Individual stands, yes, to a battalion, fine, but that is a larger scale thing. That's a skirmish thing, not a operational level or a battle thing. It's a skirmish level, and that's what the World War II thing is as well. In 172, it's virtually skirmish level. You're having 4 tanks on a 4x3 table. You might have just 2. You're having 8 squads of infantry, 1 or 2 anti-tank guns. Artillery fires the entire size of the board, so there's almost no point in putting it out there unless it becomes an objective that you have to get the guns, kind of a thing. And at any rate, the same. So, but at an operational level, which is what we're calling the 12 millimeter thing, instead of you counting bands in the skirmish firing and the rifle firing, you're counting in 172 squad hexes, the hex bands of 3. So 3 hexes automatic, next 3 hexes color on our CNC dice, and the next 3 hexes code, and the next 3 hexes code and color. Right? That's this long. In World War, or in the Civil War, a horse and musket, same thing. In 172, those bands are like either 2 or 3 hexes each. Okay, hex bands. But now, operationally, that little tank in a 2.5-inch hex now appears to be like 30 yards instead of 15 or 10 or something like that in 172. Now it looks like that hex should be like 30 yards, maybe 50 yards. So now infantry firing at point blank range, we'll say, just for sake of argument, we'll call that 25 yards. So 25 yards is not too short, right? When you're firing a musket, and yeah, it's the same kind of thing. You're firing an M1 carbine or M1 rifle or something. Yeah, it's still 25 yards, and then go to 50 yards. And then I'll go to 100 yards. Okay, now look at the newsreels, and you're looking at guys that are firing, and it's like they're firing their BAR and blah, 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 and they're firing the MG42 or whatever, and it's like, that's not really far. They don't seem to be firing 1,000 yards, right? They don't seem to be firing 500 yards. They seem to be firing like 100 yards. So what does that mean in practical sense? It means 1 hex, 2 hex, 3 hex, 4 hex. So infantry fire becomes 4 hexes on the game table in 10, 12 millimeter. All right. And then now you're talking about something like a self-propelled gun, like a howitzer. How many hexes does it still fire the table? Because it's 2,000, 2,500, 3,500 yards. For heavy artillery, maybe even 5,000 yards. Okay, so how big is the table? All right, and if you've got like 25 yards to a hex and there's 100 hexes, that's 2,500 yards, right? Well, the table is not 100 hexes. The 8-foot size table is. It's close to 80, I think. So that's somewhere close. And then so you talk about things like mortars. Well, what's the range of a mortar? Well, let's call it 1,000 yards. You have to see it with binoculars, right? You can't see with your eyes, right? It's got to be binoculars, but it's 1,000 yards. Say it's 1,000. 81 millimeter mortar, 1,000 yards. 60 millimeter mortar, in other words, a grenade launcher, 300 yards, 400 yards. Okay, so that's the kind of thing. It's what we call the time-space displacement. It's where the size of the model doesn't always dictate the ranges or the distances. It's a visual discrepancy that sometimes has to occur. You look at the old board games, computer games. They had a tank on a hex. Was that a tank or a battalion? Well, regardless, the distances were a figure, a number, but yet the models were big. Like you could see a big model on a hex, but yet there was Stalingrad, the whole battlefield of Stalingrad, but the tank was that big because you had to see it. You couldn't have a little tiny, you'd have to zoom in to actually see the figure or the thing. So when they made these old computer games, the tanks were about, on the screen, quarter inch, half inch size, but yet the whole battlefield was presented. Say it was Gettysburg. You could see the whole field of Gettysburg, and these men were like, they were towers. They were like as big as trees because in order for the user to see it, they had to be displaced. They had to be out of context with the terrain. And that's the whole point of what I'm trying to get across here is those kinds of things have to be considered when you're talking about games with miniatures. Your size of the figures, not necessarily in tune with the size of the terrain, and not necessarily in tune with the expanse of the battlefield. So there we are. And now I'm exhausted. But that was the point. The displacement visually, practically, or uh, tactically, that's the kind of stuff that has to be considered. Okay, so here we are. And where's my coffee? In order to continue to exist, coffee is a requirement. Okay, um, so I admit um, there was an incident that happened here uh, of a melee. I'll point it out. I'm sorry again about the reflectivity, but for now it can't be helped. We have a situation where we have a melee um, where this Roman unit was advanced from back here and it went into this forested area. And the opponent, the Carthaginian African units, decided, well, you know what, we're going to do the same thing. So they decided to attack this area. Now, this is the maximum distance that these troops can move, so they can't go any further. But these guys got to within a melee of this Roman unit. Now, interesting, right? The Roman unit is in a forest. Now, I understand you think, oh, that's cover. Well, uh, against missiles, yes. But against combat, well, we don't really know. I mean, melee, we can't really say for certain if a forest has any benefit in melee. And perhaps we need to amend our thinking or the rules because cover isn't always just cover. It's cover against missiles, right? But it's not cover against melee. It's actually more of an impediment. When you think about a forest and your guys are in the forest and they're being attacked, you got it's crap in your way. Bushes, trees, logs. All right. So that being said, only in the case of missiles would the Roman unit be under cover or in cover. But in a melee situation, they're not actually in any kind of protective cover being in a forest. Now I know we've said, hey, cover is cover. Here comes the enemy. They're going to melee those guys. They're in cover. Well, right. So it's a bit of a discussion, a bit of a thinking we have to consider. So at any rate, the long story short, well, that is the story. The melee happens with medium infantry, Romans, armored for the most part, versus anybody else. They're not armored. Uh, they are a value of 4. We're not going to use cover bonuses because we're going to say it doesn't exist. And the opponent here is light, so they're a value of 2. They have 2, actually, this one African unit is going to be medium, so they're going to be a value of 3. The Romans are 4. And this light infantry here is a value of 2. So we're going to consider these values when we do the melee. And I had to look it up because I couldn't remember. Basically, all you're doing is you're looking for either rolling blue or rolling red. It's a luck. If you roll red, you get a red hit. If you roll blue, you get an incremental hit. The difference of the values is what gives you an additional incremental hit. So this Roman unit is going to be an incremental hit if it's any way superior to the opponent right away, right out of the box. So versus these guys, they're greater by 1. Versus the other unit, they're greater by 2. But for now, we'll just take these guys as greater by 1. So when we did the roll, these guys, the Romans, rolled red. That's a red hit, full damage. And the Carthaginians rolled blue, which is an incremental hit. Okay. So in addition, the fact that they got the red hit was the fact that they are 1 point higher than the opponent. So they get an additional incremental hit. So they got a red hit plus a pink on the opponent. But the opponent comes back meleeing with an additional incremental hit because of the presence of another unit. So it also will roll this unit, I should say. This unit rolled. This unit's going to roll, even though it's at a deficit because it's light. It's still going to roll, and it's going because it's additional to this. They're combined. It's going to get automatically an incremental hit. So that's how that works. When you have units combined, you don't have to roll and roll and roll and all that kind of stuff. You simply roll for the one unit you're concentrating on, and then you add the incremental hit for the extra unit. If that extra unit is on par with the target, then it becomes another consideration. But in this case, they're still weaker, so they're only going to get 1 incremental hit. If they were medium infantry, they would get an incremental hit. If they were the same weight, they would get another incremental hit, but they're not. If they were, it would be much more helpful, but it's not the case. So the reason that exists is so that by the reports of history, a single unit in defense can repel a greater number of the enemy. Otherwise, a single unit, if it didn't have that kind of reality, would be obliterated every time. And that's just not the case. The potential should exist, and it does, for a single unit outnumbered to be able to repel the enemy. And that is why you don't have this value of the attacker being 3 with this next unit being also 3 or 2 in this case. So it's not a question of 3 plus 2 equals 5. It's a question of the individual things versus the one thing. So 3 versus 4, 2 versus 4. If this was 4 versus 4, it would be another incremental because they're equal. But 3 versus 4 is still -1. Still, it's an incremental. All right? So that's the way that works. And the reason I say it that way is because this other unit that I was just talking about is in addition to this guy. His greater numbers should not be so overwhelming that the defender doesn't have a chance. That's the point. That's why that works that way. All right. So when we tally up the losses, oh, and by the way, the other question is, what does the extra unit, what kind of damage does the extra unit get? And the answer is the primary unit in the melee gets the damage, but the extra unit automatically gets an incremental hit as well. It gets divided, or primary gets the most damage, secondary gets the least damage, which is an incremental hit. So you still cause an incremental hit even though you're outnumbered. All right, so then we did that, and that's where we're at. And if the game is being played where the results must be immediate, in other words, the loser of the melee gets repulsed, then fine. That's what happens here. In other words, who's the loser? The loser is the one that causes or that suffers the most damage. And in this case, it would be this Carthaginian unit here, suffering a red hit plus a incremental, and it would be this one not, right? This one here only suffered one incremental hit because it was additional and the Romans automatically caused an incremental hit. So that is all it did. Now that one doesn't have to run, but this one, if you wanted to play the game that way, the most damage caused means you run away. The guy who gets hurt the most runs away. Then this would be running away and these two guys would still be intact. They would be in contact. But we're not doing it that way. I'm just saying you could do it that way. So what we're doing here is we're putting on the markers, in this case, the O-ring damage. So there is a incremental hit here, there's a red hit plus an incremental hit here, and there's an incremental hit here, and that's the way it is. The next round will now decide what the conclusion is, probably. So that's that, and we'll come back.